In this video of the Historic Ordnance series, I have a Soviet mine from World War II. This is the Soviet OZM-UVK bounding fragmentation mine. Now, I was not aware that this thing existed, but I came across references to it on Russian sapper websites that Russian sappers in Ukraine have been encountering these. And I had to really look it up. You know, they said it was from World War II, so I looked in that direction, and then I was finally able to track down some info on this. Now, according to U.S. military info from early in the Cold War, this is just referred to as the OZM. Not much information comes up on that. When I used the Soviet designation for it, which is the OZM-UVK or the OZM with UVK, especially on Russian websites, I was able to pull up a ton of info on this for its history and the information on how it was employed. Now, the countries that have this, there's not a lot of information on it. The only thing I came across is that these, at the end of World War II, ended up in emergency war stocks across the Soviet Union, and that's how Ukraine has them, because they have mines filled with Soviet emergency war stocks, which they've been using. And apparently hidden inside some of those old salt mines were crates of these. That is the UVK-1 propelling apparatus. Now, this is classified as an engineered device according to the Russian military. It's not classified as a fuse or as a mine. Now, this reportedly entered service in early 1942. The Red Army needed landmines to try to slow down the advancing Russian troops. So a development team of 4 different scientists got together and they thought up this: a propelling device that could be attached to artillery and mortar projectiles and used on the front lines as kind of a final protective shield. According to the old Soviet doctrine, basically these were meant to be used kind of along the lines that we use claymores nowadays. They're meant to be electrically fired, command-detonated when the enemy they're past the obstacles, they're about to jump into your trenches. You know, it's that last ditch before your troops are starting to go bayonet to bayonet or hand-to-hand combat. You set these off right into massive enemy troops. Now, there's 3 of these in the series. The UVK-1, which was meant for Soviet projectiles, in particular 85mm to 122mm artillery projectiles, and also 82mm and 120mm mortars. The 152mm they found out was too heavy for the UVK-1, even though the thread pattern is the same. So troops on the front lines were told, don't use those. They did create a UVK-2, and that had a thread pattern on it for use with captured German artillery projectiles and mortars. Now, in 1942, about mid-42, the Red Army got a hold of a large amount of 152mm projectiles that were not made correctly. Reportedly, the sides on them were too weak and they were showing up at the front lines with cracks. They were ruptured. These could not be fired safely from the artillery pieces. So the Red Army talked to the Ordnance Board, told them, hey, we got these, we want to use these. You got the UVK-1 propelling apparatus, which we're using with other stuff. Can we please have a version that we can attach to these heavier projectiles and use? So they kicked out the UVK-3. That's the one that looks like was designed for the 152mm. And on that one, they basically doubled the height on it and doubled or tripled the amount of black powder that was in here as the propellant to launch these projectiles out of the ground. And then that particular setup was known as the OZM-152. Otherwise, if it's with the UVK1 or UVK2, it was known as the OZM-UVK. Now, technicals on this, they are 3.5 inches in height from the base to the top of the booster charge here, 5 inches in diameter. Weight is 6 2/3 pounds, of which there is a 3.5 ounce black powder propelling charge in the base here, and then directly above that, which gets screwed into the fuse well of the projectile, there is a 3/4 of an ounce tetral booster. This propelling device was made out of steel and only came in green. Temp range that these could be employed in was -50 degrees Fahrenheit to a max of 122 degrees Fahrenheit because of the explosive in here. These could be set off in 2 different ways. It could be set off as command-detonated by use of a firing wire and a blast machine. It could also be set up in this configuration up here, which is from the U.S. Army manual, with what's referred to as a flash tube on the side, and on the end of it was attached a MOV series fuse with detonator. I think that was the MD2 or MD5. In this version, a tripwire is connected to it for the enemy soldier to set it off. Now, once these went off, it propelled the projectile up out of the ground between 1.5 to 2.5 meters above the ground before the booster charge detonated. Reportedly, from the impulse to set it off, to initiate, to the projectile detonating above the ground was between 1/3 to 3/4 of a second, depending on weight of projectile, how it was loaded, and that type of stuff. Either way, it went off in less than 1 second from the initiation pulse. Casualty radius on this depended on the piece of ordnance that was used with it, but reportedly kill radius was between 12 meters to 20 meters. 12 meters with the smaller mortar projectiles, 20 meters with the heavier artillery projectiles. These devices came 10 propelling apparatuses per wooden crate. The projectile did not come with it. Those came as they do normally, showed up at the front line for use with the mortar or with an artillery piece. The sapper just went, got it if they were authorized it, attached it, use them as mines. Now, doctrinally on these, from what I can find, it looks like these were meant as a final protective line. The enemy troops, they've crossed the anti-tank ditches, they've crossed the minefields, they're through the wire, they're about to jump into your trenches, either your first line or probably second line defenses. These were emplaced in the ground at a density of 100 per kilometer of front line, and they were meant to be set off electrically. And they were set off with one of 2 devices that I could find. Individually, they were set off with the PM3 blast machine, or if they were set off in a series, they used something as known as the CRAB-IM, the CRAB-IM control panel, and each one of those control panels was tied into 10 of these mines. So the enemy troops are coming through. They're now over the top of the field where these are buried in the ground. That engineer officer has the order. He detonates these directly in the midst of the enemy troops. These were meant as anti-personnel devices, but there were notes from the Soviets in World War II that if these went off underneath German tanks, especially if it's an artillery projectile like the 122 millimeter, if that's going off underneath the enemy tank, it will shred it. It will blow it to pieces. especially early in the war, when they're dealing with the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, the Panzer 38Ts, and that stuff. Now there is a note that when these are set up for command detonation, the firing point needs to be a minimum of 90 meters away, and that soldier needs to be dug in, preferably in a bunker with overhead cover to project from splinters from these going off. These can be employed inside frozen ground or freezing ground, and when that happens, you need to put the projectile inside the wooden crate that the projectile comes in. Make sure that it'll be able to exit when it's set off. So you open up one side here, slide the projectile down inside, run the firing wire out. You would put the cover over the top and then just camouflage it. Then it could be used in ground that's freezing. You were not allowed to place it in the ground normally like this if the ground would freeze, because the ground would hold that projectile in the ground, massively degrading the effects. Now, how to put this in, I'm going to give you the information on this from both ways, from the command detonated and also victim initiated. First off, with command detonation, electrical. You're going to go through, inspect your projectile first. Make sure it's usable. Doesn't matter if it's rusty, doesn't matter if it's cracked, as long as the explosive inside is usable and the fuse well is not too messed up that you cannot attach the UVK1 or UVK2 or UVK3 propelling apparatus to it. You also need to go through, run a circuit check on the propelling apparatus itself, and you also need to do a continuity check on the firing wire. Make sure everything's working correctly. If it is, everything gets loaded up in a truck, taken to the location where it's going to be placed. At that location, the soldier digs a hole minimum of 8 inches in diameter and to a depth where you get a max of 2 to 3 inches of dirt and camouflage material over the top of what's the back side of the projectile here, which becomes the top of the mine. Hole is prepped. At that point, screw on the UVK1 into the fuse well of the projectile. Then you're going to attach on the firing wire to the leads off the propelling apparatus. Lower the projectile down into the hole, backfill the dirt around it, and then camouflage over the top. Run the firing wire back to the firing point, camouflaging it along the way. Once all the wires are back to the firing point, everyone is cleared off of that field. You then do a continuity check, a circuit check of the entire series of mines. Make sure everything works. If something doesn't work, you go through and replace that component, whether it's a firing wire, which more than likely what the brake would be is the wire, or the propelling apparatus. Enemy troops are coming through the area. That's when the that's when that sapper hits the clacker, hits that button on the control panel, sets these off in the midst of the enemy troops. Now, recovery on these, there's two different ways. It depends on if it's the sapper who emplaced it who's removing it, or the sapper who's found it. Now, if it's the sappers who are in charge of that field, they've been told to recover these mines, they're no longer needed. First thing you're going to do, you're going to disconnect that firing wire from your blast machine or your control panel. Then you're going to follow your firing wire out to where the mine is at. Dig down around it till you can pull the whole projectile up out of the ground. At that point, you're going to disconnect the firing wire from the leads of the UVK1. You're then going to unscrew the UVK1 from the projectile, clean everything up, wrap it up, turn it in for reuse. Now, if you're the sapper who comes across these, the enemy put these in, you look out, you find a firing wire. Uncover the firing wire a bit so that you can try to get an idea what it is. Maybe. You then go through and you cut the firing wire one side at a time, not both at the same. If you take that wire cutters, cut both sides at the same time, you run the risk of completing the circuit and setting this off. You cut her off, you cut it one side at a time, one strand at a time. At that point, you're going to follow the wire to where the mine is at. As you're going, you're looking for booby traps. You're looking for protective mines. Find a location where the wire now goes straight down in the ground. You're not pulling it up out of the ground anymore. It's going straight in. You know the mine is there. Dig it out, and as you're digging it out, you're looking for anti-handling devices or booby traps attached to the mine. If you encounter that, stop what you're doing, destroy the mine in place. If none are found and you get all the way to the bottom to the UVK propelling apparatus, you then remove the projectile from the ground and you unscrew the propelling apparatus from the projectile. And then everything gets turned in for destruction in a safe location. Now, in placing this as a victim-initiated or victim-operated mine. So we're thinking on this, we're guerrilla soldiers, we're putting this in behind enemy lines, we're going to put it in next to a road or trail that enemy troops patrol down. In that situation, we're probably going to use a mortar shell. But you can use artillery, but mortar is probably the preferred method. You're going to go through, you're going to check the UVK1 apparatus. You're going to check your projectile, make sure it's usable. You don't have explosive leaking out the side. You're going to make sure that you have what's referred to as the flash tube, which is an attachment that goes on here. You're going to make sure you have the MUV or MUV-1 fuse and a detonator, and everything is serviceable. You also make sure you have a stake to bring with you as an anchor and tripwire. Transport everything to the location where it's going to be in place. You're going to put it across that enemy trail. You're going to set it right next to it so that it'll go off right next to that enemy patrol. You're going to dig a hole sufficient in size and depth that you can place the mine in. Remember, a max of 2 to 3 inches of earth and camouflage over the top. Maximum. You're then going to go through and you're going to attach the flash tube to the side of the UVK1 here. You're then going to screw this onto the mortar projectile into the fuse well. You're then going to place it into the hole, backfill the dirt. Now, how you attach the flash tube on here, I forgot to mention, there is a plug here on the side, which is right next to where the lead wires are. You just unscrew that and then screw in the flash tube onto this. Now, we got the mine is in the ground. We attach the detonator to the fuse, and then screw that into the end of the flash tube here above the ground. We then find an anchor point on the other side of the trail, or we put in place the stake. We attach the tripwire to that, run it back to the fuse. Once we're back at the fuse, we're going to remove safety pin up here and the safety collar. That's right above the pull pin here. We tie in the tripwire into this hole here where the safety pin was, put it under tension so that it pulls out the striker a little bit. Make sure it's secured on that tripwire. At that point, you're going to go through, remove the pull pin. Then you camouflage the whole thing. Now how that works, the enemy troop walks along that trail, hits that tripwire, breaks it, and that's what allows the striker here to fly forward, hitting the percussion cap, setting off the detonator. The blast or flash from the detonator goes down the flash tube here, down into UVK1, into the side here, setting off the black powder, starting the whole process of projecting this up out of the ground to about 2.5 meters above the ground, where it will then detonate in the group of enemy troops. Now, how you would disarm this if you come across this, and the only thing that you would see is the top of the flash tube and the fuse here with the tripwire. You're going to check around it first for any other booby traps or protective mines. Neutralize them as you come across them. Once you're ready to tackle the mine here, you're first going to check both ends of the tripwire. Make sure that there isn't a booby trap on the other end of the tripwire. So follow it out to the anchor stake. Make sure there's nothing there. Come back to the fuse here. Once you're back at this fuse, you're going to insert a stiff wire into here, or a pull pin or safety pin if you can get it in there if you have it. That will neutralize the striker from activating. At that point, you can go through, cut the tripwire with the wire cutters. You will then unscrew the MUV fuse with detonator from the flash tube, set it to the side. You will then dig out the mine, checking for anti-handling devices and booby traps. If any are found, stop what you're doing, destroy it in place. If none are encountered, you will then remove the mine from the ground. You will unscrew the projectile from the UVK1 propelling apparatus, and you'll turn everything into the mine dump for either your use or for destruction. Just checking here, see if I have any additional information. As I said, it looks like the only locations where these were sent to after World War II was into Soviet wartime reserve. That is how Ukraine got a hold of them. They came across them in those old Soviet war stocks, and they're using them against the Russians. I do not have any information as to the tactics on how these are being employed against Russian troops by the Ukrainians. I don't know if these are being used as that final protective line of mines to be command detonated in the faces and the formations of the Russian troops as they're penetrating Ukrainian defenses, which happens a lot, or if these are being employed by Ukrainian militia behind Russian lines, how it's being done. I don't know. The chance of one of these being encountered is kind of low, but it's not zero. This is a pretty simple device. This is something that was, thought up quickly at the start of World War II that could be cranked out of a really basic factory or workshop to use projectiles as mines. So there were notes that it looks like with Soviet partisans, what they would do with these is they would set these projectiles up along the sides of roads, and then as the German convoys would come through, that is when they would initiate them right next to the vehicles to damage them and hopefully kill a bunch of the enemy troops. My guess is that's probably kind of what they're being used for today. The types of ordnance that these were meant to be used for, the UVK-1s, was 85 millimeter up to 122 millimeter artillery projectiles, or 82 millimeter 120 millimeter mortars. For German shells, it's going to be their 82 millimeter mortars or 81 millimeter mortars up through about a 105 millimeter artillery projectile. Larger than that, other than the 120 millimeter mortar which the Germans adopted from the Soviets. Larger than that, probably the UVK2 was insufficient to be used with. It was too heavy to propel it out of the ground. The UVK3, it looks like that is what was designed for use with the 152 millimeter projectile, specifically because it had more of a propelling charge in here to get that piece of ordnance up and out of the ground. So there you go. An expedient device designed at the start of World War II that was used reportedly in large numbers by Soviet engineers during the war as a final defensive line when enemy troops would breach defenses. So something to be aware that this type of thing did exist. It could appear again on the battlefield in some other form. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember essayons.